So, this presents a synopsis of the history of natural and cultural environment during the last about 4 million years. The environmental change during the Quaternary, Paleolithic, Mesolithic and Neolithic periods have been briefly presented. The environmental changes during the historic period were especially after the Industrial Revolution 1779, when the fossil fuel was started being used for industrial and domestic purposes, and large scale mineral extraction from mining areas have been examined. A synoptic view of the impact of agriculture development in the developed countries and the green revolution in the developing countries has been made. So, if you see the picture here, we will understand how the importance of agriculture has come down over the period and how the importance of knowledge has increased over a last 4 million years ago. So, this gives us an idea how the civilization have moved from the basic what we call as the primary activity to the quinary activity. So, here this gives an idea of what and how the stages of what you call the interaction of human being with nature has emerged, right from agriculture to the knowledge variations. Human beings must always have been concerned with their environment if it was their immediate surroundings that provided the resources necessary for survival. Prehistoric and pre-literate times, the only testimony to life was the prehistoric cave paintings. These cave paintings depicted the picture of rocks, sheep, goats, horse, deer, dog, wolf, etc., and gave an idea about the wildlife, what was their relationship between man and the environment with his surroundings. The agents of environmental change are numerous and the processes involved in this change are very complex. During the past 2 or 3 million years, major agents of environmental change have been climate and human, both of which directly affect the processes operative in environmental system. Physical landscapes, which gives us an idea about the geography as the study of man's relationship with the environment, has a long history and has led to a long standing debate about the position of man in relation to nature first, whether man is part of or path from nature, secondly about the extent to which man is affected by the environment. From classical times onwards, the idea that man is a product of the environment was dominant, as we have discussed yesterday, and in the 19th century the work of Darwin in the biological sciences, which showed that life developed under the selective action of natural forces, that seemed to confirm scientifically the position of man as a creature adapted to his environment. At the same time, work in the social sciences showed regularities in human behavior, that marriage rates in England, for example, were affected by the price of corn, and the conclusion was reached that man was not free but was ruled by nature and economic laws. This resulted in many geographers focusing their study on the effects of the physical environment on man, in which he is seen as a passive creature molded by natural forces, and the geographer's task as being the identification and formulation of the scientific laws which govern the relationship. This approach is known as determinism or environmentalism, and simple cause and effect laws, which can be stated as, if conditions A and B exist, then condition C will be the consequence, were formulated to explain the distribution and activities of man. According to Semple, where the hot moist equatorial climate increase the growth of large forests which harbor abundant game and yield abundant fruits, they prolong the hunter stage of development and related the advance to agriculture. However, determinism was criticized for two main reasons. First, it was clear that similar physical environments do not produce the same responses, and if you see the Mediterranean civilization of Greece and Rome did not develop on similar conditions, and in the same the Australasia, South Africa, Chile and California, where we find these type of climates. Also, man can respond to the same way to different environments, and there is considerable similarity in European settlement in the varied environment of North America. Secondly, although environment influences man, man also influences the environment, and the cause effect relationship of determinism is too simple to explain this. As a result, the idea that man is controlled by nature, this was rejected, and other geographers stress the fact that man is free to choose. Nevertheless, this choice must be made within the limits set by nature. Although these limits were wide enough to give a man a lot of scope, this approach, in which the emphasis is firmly placed on man rather than nature, and which man is seen as an active force rather than passive being, is known as possibilism. In reality, of course, the balance between man's freedom and nature's control varies from place to place and from time to time, and extremes of possibilism and determinism must be replaced by a sliding scale in which man and nature act and react with each other in a very complex system. Man's reaction to the environment and his action upon it can be considered as an interaction model or system, and one of the tasks of the geographers is to identify its major parts of measures their relative importance. The three basic elements in this model, man and the environment and the relationship between them, are examined. So, most geographers take a possibilistic view rather than a deterministic view today. Although some introductory texts adhere to the earlier approach, this is not to say that the role of environment is unimportant, because it provides that setting within which man operates, presenting him with a range of opportunities and constraints. Nevertheless, it is not easy to measure the influence of the environment on man because of complexity of relationship in the interaction model. An increasing number of people are living in the man-made environment of cities. Their relationship with the natural environment is not direct, but even the dwellers of the built environment are dependent on the earth for food and raw materials. The environmental factors which does affect all people directly is climate, and it has been suggested that it is the basic reason for man's racial differences of skin color, size and shape. It is not clear how it affects man's activity despite centuries of speculation about its effect on character and behavior. Aristotle believed that people of cold climates were brave but deficient in thought, while the peoples of warm climate were thoughtful but without spirit. The medieval Arab historian Ibn Khaldun compared the stolidity and lack of vivacity among peoples of cold climate with the passionate natures and ready abandonment to physical pleasures of people in warm zones. Both these writers, sharing their views, have been held through history that saw the climate zones between these extremes usually the place in which they were writing, as pronouncing more ideal human beings stop this view that there is some climatically ideal zone that has been developed more recently by Huntington and Markham. According to their theories, the climate of areas in moderately cool zones is frequently cyclonic activity, and rapid changes of weather such as Western Europe, in New England and Japan stimulate individuals to mental activities and nations to world leadership. Fluctuation and changes in climate after both spatially and temporally, the causes of which are a source of considerable speculation and controversy. External factors such as changes in solar radiation, sunspots, and internal factors such as adjustment within the Earth's atmospheric circulation may either singly or in combination be responsible for climate change. Moreover, human activity may contribute to climate change by advertently affecting the global carbon cycle custom, the Earth's climatic system is extremely complex and their mechanism of climatic processes are not yet completely understood. This sort of confusion is very difficult to substantiate because climate is only one of many factors which affect human activity, but climate does affect behavior. Man can modify these effects by creating his own climate, and this has been done for a very long time. To stop, man has used for more than 500,000 years, and advanced societies are using very sophisticated central heating or air conditioning system, but this only operate in indoors and small scale, and attempts to affect major modifications to the climate are very limited. To stop climate remains important influence on human activity. Despite advances in technology, man is still ultimately dependent on the physical environment for all his material needs and desire. Of course, the nature of this dependence varies from society to society, from primitive societies where drought results in from mild to advanced societies, and where the connection with the environment is much more complicated, but the ultimate source of all food and raw material remains the same for all groups. More than half the world's labor force is employed in the primary industries of farming, fishing, forestry and mining, and which the physical environment is the dominant influence. It is not only through the range and abundance of its natural resources that the environment affects man, but also through the fact that one of its most important characteristic is the change. To stop three main types of climate change that been identified, and they affect men in quite different ways, having both the positive and the negative effects on human activity system. The first of these is long term regular change, such as the silting of coast and rivers. Silt plays an important role in maintaining the fertility of floodplains for agriculture, but also for ports. The second and probably the most important is short term regular change, such as the rhythm of the season, which closely regulated agriculture for the annual migration of animals and fishes, which dominate the lives of hunter and the fishermen. Sometimes these rhythms falter and unusual weather condition may bring in bumper harvest, but the change can just as easily be disastrous, and the failure of the monsoon brings severe hardships, particularly in India. However, it is the third type, rapid unpredictable change, such as earthquakes, hurricanes, cyclones, for floods, which affect man most spectacularly. However, despite such setbacks, man has extended his dominion to almost all parts of the earth, and history is one of and increasingly ability to use the environment to his best advantage. This dominion can never be completed because of the powerful restraint imposed by nature, but for geographers increasingly turning their attention to the study of man's impact on the environment to understand how it operates and to identify its consequences and suggest how it can be managed. Although the scale of man's impact on the environment has accelerated rapidly since the Industrial Revolution, man has been a factor in environmental change for at least last 40,000 years, since the late stages of Pleistocene Ice Age. Early man used fire. His first great tool, the accidental effects its use would be considerable. The later, the fire was deliberately used to improve grasslands, to the which grazing animals would be attracted and more easily hunted. The impact of primitive peoples can be considerably, and when the European settlers first went to the America, they did not enter a totally untouched world, since the forest and grasslands were already very much modified by human activity. Even today, primitive culture groups use fire in system of shifting agriculture known as slash and burn, and few parts of the world have been affected by man. As a consequence of human activity since the Pleistocene and especially since 1750 AD, it is very difficult to define the term natural environment, because so many parts of the world what is generally taken to be the natural environment such as vegetation and animal life have been so greatly changed that they might be considered man made. These changes have been brought about as a result of man's attempt to modify the earth to increase its capacity to support him and to satisfy his increasingly large range of needs and desires. The two methods have been used to achieve these ends. First, the area of the 𝗖𝗍, which is the Greek term for the inhabited earth, has been extended in number of ways. The most obvious of these has been the series of migration by which man has spread to almost all parts of the earth. The most expensive of these has been the outpouring of Europeans to the almost empty lands of the Americas, South Africa and Australasia since the 1500 AD. So, the 𝗖𝗍 has been further extended by technology. The new areas of human occupancy have been created by drainage and land reclamation schemes such as the Delta project in Holland, or by large scale migration schemes such as the Aswan Dam in Egypt. The margins of cultivation has been extended, and by the development of drought tolerant plants, the breeding of animals capable of thriving in hot climates, and new methods of cultivation such as dry farming technology. By creating a demand for minerals, it has led to human settlement in the most hostile of environment such as the desert oil fields of the Sahara or the high altitude tin mines in Bolivia, and even the sea floor is now being exploited. The second and most important, man has intensified his use of the environment to increase its productivity capacity. In the field of agriculture, new high yielding crops have been developed such as the miracle rice, IR8 instrumental in the green revolution in Southeast Asia. Artificial fertilizers have been developed to sustain them, pesticides developed to protect them, and machines produced to cultivate them. High yielding animals have been bred such as sheep that regularly produce twins, pigs that fatten quickly, and cows that produce milk with high butter fat content. In the field of industry, new processes have been developed to produce large quantities of goods. New materials such as plastic have been created, and the size and range of the demand for raw materials have been greatly expanded. For very fortunate minority of the world's population living in the advanced economies, the consequences of all these activity has been a vast increase in the standard of living and the removal of most of the life risk and uncertainties. However, this has not been without its price, and some of the most serious problem that faces arises from the increasing demands that he is placing on the environment. These demands, which are now placing a severe strain on some areas, and most of the resources are caused by the interaction of four main factors. So, the first of these four factors is that the population growth. The population of the world is not growing at a constant rate, but it is growing exponentially or at an accelerating rate. It took just over a century to double in 45 years and is expected to double again in only 35 years. So, the consequence of this is clear: more land and natural resources will be needed, more waste will be created, and impact on environment will be immense. It has been calculated that the carrying capacity of earth is about 30,000 million people at the starvation level, and that this figure will be achieved in 100 years and less population growth levels will be done. The second factor closely associated with the first is the rise in aspirations, which serves to multiply the impact of population growth. Standard of living are higher and increasing in advanced economies, with the consequent high level of demand for resources. These standards are naturally the ones to which the developing countries aspire, and so any process of development will increase the pressure on resources. It has been calculated that the birth of an American child was an impact on the environment which is 40 times as great as the impact caused by the birth of an Indian child, because of the difference in the amount of resources that each will consume in his lifetime. The environmental consequences of a rise in living standards in India are clear. Thirdly, this impact is increased by advances in technology. A desire for increased standards of living can only come about if man is capable of achieving them, but this power has been given by technology. Technological change is exponential and man's power to change the environment is increasing rapidly. Technology affects the environment in two ways. First, the ability of man directly to cause environment change has increased. The development of the steel plough in the 19th century enabled the mid-latitude grasslands to be cultivated for the first time, because the new plough could cut through the tough prairie sod, while the development of steam driven ships enabled all of the 100 or so species of whale to be hunted instead of just 5 which were slow enough to be caught by oarsmen. Secondly, entirely new substances such as plastics, DDT and radioactive waste have been introduced to nature. As technology has developed, the number of ways in which man affects the environment has increased and their effects have become more widespread. The final and probably the most important factor in man's relationship with the environment, his attitude towards it. In Western culture, man is seen to be apart from rather than part of nature. Although an increasing number of societies are embracing Marxism, this also has produced social attitudes which make population control more difficult and economic attitudes which see growth as progress and short term economic gains as being more important than long term environmental consequences. Until now, these attitudes have been acceptable because growth has been possible and the general condition of man has been steadily improving. But there is an increasing realization that even if man is not part of nature, he must learn to manage the environment more carefully than has been necessary in the past. This realization has come about because it is clear that although man has affected the environment in many deliberate and positive ways, there are consequences of human activity which are accidental and uncontrolled and which could ultimately threaten life itself. Some idea of the complexity of the problem can be gained from an examination of the effects of human activity on world climate through interference with the heat balance. The burning of fossil fuels such as coal and oil has increased the carbon dioxide content in the atmosphere and increasing the greenhouse effect and trapping more heat within the environment. There is a risk that as a consequence world temperature are rising, causing and melting of ice caps and flooding of densely populated lowland areas which we are seeing today. On the other hand, the increasing amount of solid material being pumped into the atmosphere acts as a parasol, reflecting heat back into the space, and it has been estimated that high flying jet aircrafts have increased the cloud cover over the Atlantic by 5%, and if this cover were worldwide, temperature would fall to produce another ice age. Whether one cancels the other out is not clear at the moment, but they are consequences of human activity that had not been foreseen. So, the list of possible dangers is considerably and has resulted in a great deal of concern being expressed in recent years over the problems of pollution. So many dangerous substances are being introduced into the environment, whether deliberately as in the case of agriculture pesticides or causally as in the case of industrial waste products, or incidentally as in the case of the lead content of motor cars exhaust, or accidentally as in the case of poisoning of river Rhine in the 1986, that life itself may be under threat. The exhaustion of resources due to overexploitation is considered by many people to be equally serious threat and has resulted in calls for the conservation and management of resource before the situation becomes critical. So, the interaction between man and environment therefore has two aspects, with environment influencing man and man influencing environment. This might be seen as a two-way system, but in reality it is not simple and consequences of this interaction are inevitable. Mismanagement of the environment by bad farming practices on the high plains of the USA were compounded by period of drought in the years 1933 to 38, and this produced disastrous consequences for man as strong winds blew away the exhausted topsoil in a series of black blizzards to produce the notorious dust bowl, which covered about 6.5 million hectares. In this area, the direct effect of human activity on the environment produced feedbacks which are described as positive when they operate to amplify change and negative when they operate to reduce change. Large areas were made useless for agriculture by bad farming practice, but the national emergency caused by soil erosion had some beneficial effect on man's ability to manage the environment by the establishment of the US Soil Conservation Bureau and the Natural Resource Board, whose conservation practices provided negative feedback to reduce the damage. There was of course the time lag between the occurrence and the damage and the effect of the policies, and this type of change is also described as lagged feedback. On the other hand, the disaster had a harmful effect in causing mass migration to California, where good agricultural lands became overcrowded. Thus, the positive feedback from events in Oklahoma and Texas, but transferred to California, and such feedbacks in which one area pays for the actions of another are described as staggered. Far from being a simple two-way system, man's impact on the environment may be direct, but it is much more likely to result in feedbacks which can be positive or negative and lagged and or staggered depending on circumstance. As a result, the simple interaction model becomes a complicated system. However, there are two problems associated with the use of ecosystem approach. The first concerns the scale and complexity of the system, which make it very difficult to analyze. The second one, which concerns the role of man. The ecosystem implies some sort of balanced functioning whole, but man is increasingly the dominant element in the system and may not even be an integral part of it. If it is accepted that man is not part of nature, very complex in socio-economic consideration are the most important factors that affecting the man's relationship with the environment, and which is becoming increasingly man-made, and these have been taken into account. There are two main approaches to the study of human geography, and these involve the analysis of two major systems, the ecological and the spatial. In this chapter, the ecological system created by the interaction of man and environment, and it appears that this can be best analyzed as a control system with man the dominant element in it. The role of culture in man-environment relationship has been emphasized, since it is culture that influences the man, the nature of human intervention in the system. The operation of the ecological system produces an imprint on the land that can be described as a cultural landscape, and the study of these landscapes has been a major element in geography since the end of the 19th century. However, geographers are now giving increasing attention to process rather than form, especially the role that culturally produced perception play in man's evaluation and use of the environment, which will be discussed in the next module.